Welcome to the DRF Sports Podcast, brought to you by DRF Sports. America's most trusted name in horse racing is now providing sports bettors with exclusive data, analytics, previews, videos, and expert picks on all major sports. Bet smarter and have more fun doing it. It's the DRF Sports Podcast, and now your host, Sheldon Alexander. Ready, set, bet.
This is the DRF Sports Podcast, episode 53. Don't forget to like and follow wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander. And as someone who loves to watch Duke lose, that Coach K swan song at home was just incredible. And a reminder that the madness is here and it's March. But also the NBA season is in high gear as LeBron drops 56 and the Lakers actually win. So many more ways for us to win money on sports and basketball. But first, a reminder, be a pro and win with DRF Sports Pro, introducing DRF Sports all new premium data feature on drf.com/sports. For $99 a year, which is just $825 a month, you can get industry leading betting trends, angles, and analytics. With the madness almost here, it's the best way for you to make some money this March and have fun while doing it. It's DRF Sports Pro. Sign up now at drf.com/sports. And hopefully we can keep our pro picks here going as well on the pod. Today, we continue our prep for the NCAA tournament as the conference tournaments are really kicking into high gear now. Plus, the NBA is going crazy, and we're here to find out where we can find the value in betting on the NBA. And for that, once again, our guy Matt Russell is here to join us, and that starts right about now. So we got LeBron dropping 50 pieces. There's more great college basketball games. It's March, which means the madness is here, which means my guy Matt Russell is here to break it all down and get you set for the conference tournaments and more. And I'm just going to simply start here. What a betting weekend in college basketball, my friend. How are you doing?
I'm lucky to be alive at this point, man. Like every game going overtime, like every third game going down to whether it's in overtime or at the end of regulation with 1 second left, there's a foul called and this team's down one. And like, is the kid going to make 2 free throws? Is he going to make 0 free throws? Both seem just as likely, even though the percentages would tell you that shouldn't be the case, but you just never know, man. Like it's a 65% free throw shooter and he's bricking 2, he's making 2. We're going to overtime. We're not, 3-pointers. And it's like, it's so much under the radar stuff, right? Like Boston and Navy yesterday, right? Like Boston University is hitting a 3-pointer at the bell to send it to overtime and then gets another chance later on. And you're just reeling. And so, I had this crazy weekend where on Friday, I'm sitting there and like normally we come on, whether it's football or basketball, we talk about like the bad beats that we take. And like, if you're in a position to take a bad beat, it usually means you're doing something correctly, right? Like you're in a spot of advantage, if you will. I always say like you're in college basketball, certainly you're betting on the first 39 minutes of a basketball game. And hopefully you can be in such a good position that it doesn't really matter once the chaos of that final minute hits, right? With fouls and chucking threes to trying to come back in the game, and a 2-point game somehow becomes an 8-point game, or an 8-point game somehow becomes a 2-point game, right? If you're in good enough of a cushion there, then more often than not, it's going to work out in your favor. Well, on Friday, I would say it was probably my luckiest day of the year. I had some ridiculous wins. I had Longwood -6.5 win in overtime. When does that ever happen, Shell? When do we ever in our lives get a pretty big favorite at -6.5 to get them to cover in overtime? I had Southeast Missouri State. I had them +16, +16.5 actually. And they ended up closing 14.5. So I did what I was supposed to, right? I got out ahead of the market and then the move down to 14.5. And so I'm like, okay, closing line value, that's great. But closing line value doesn't do you a lot of good when it's a 23-point game with 3.5 minutes left. And, Murray State, who is just an absolute wagon at this point, like they don't look like they're going to have any issues sort of closing this game out. And I end up getting that win, and everybody did, because that game ended up landing on 14 because Southeast Missouri State just kept trying. God bless them, because they just kept trying. And Murray State obviously had sort of phoned it in once they'd been up 23 points. And so I turned what probably, frankly, should have been a 7-10 type of Friday into a 9-8, right? Small winning day. And you just go, okay, how did I get away with that, right? But the thing about sports betting and the gambling gods and all of those sorts of things is you can get 2 lucky wins, but somehow that means you're getting like 4 really unlucky losses, like within 24 hours, right? Like that's just how it works. Because I wake up on Saturday and 3 of the first 4 games, just sort of allow this for a second here. Tennessee -6. They're up 51-30 at halftime. Now, beyond the fact that they're up 21 points at home against an Arkansas team who had played like intense game, home game over and over and over again the last few weeks, like they were in a terrible spot to try to get up for that last game on the road at Tennessee, and Tennessee takes advantage of that. And it's 51-30. Forget about the 21-point lead. How about just the fact that they scored 51 points in the first half? Well, like how many points are you going to score in the second half that's going to screw that lead up? Well, Tennessee found it. And they ended up, of course, winning the game anyway, but only by 4 points after letting that lead dwindle away. And they're celebrating on the court. They're so happy they got the win. And I'm like, you losers didn't cover the point spread despite being up 21 points. This is the most infuriating thing. And then upstate, South Carolina upstate, which again, I realize is, probably not a game that a ton of people are necessarily all over. They're +7.
That's not even a real team. I don't believe you that this is a real team. That's fake.
They're up +7, and they're +7. They're up 25-9 in the first half, and they lose by 9. They are, they're down 2 with 3 minutes left. They lose by 9. It's they're basically not covering for 10 seconds in the entire game. And this is all happening at the same time as Tennessee. And then as those two are done, I'm like, man, those 2 beats are really, really absurd melts in the second half. And while that has just happened, I'm like, well, at least we have Syracuse -1.5, who have a 7-point lead with 1 minute and 9 seconds to go. And so, and also very good free throw shooters, by the way. So you're like, okay, they're going to salt this away. It's -1.5, right? We only need them to win by 2. We effectively just need them to win. Well, they have 3 turnovers in a row, basically before they even cross half. And Miami steals the win in Syracuse. And you're just sitting here going, I kind of thought I was going to go 4-1 to start, and now I'm 1-4 to start. And so why is this relevant, right? Why are we talking about these bad beats? Because we don't normally sort of go break down, games that we've won or lost. People ask me, like, why do you bet so many games? Because I bet a ton of college basketball games. And here's why. For one, I need to bet enough games that I can make up the variance of that last minute. So there's a couple of different things here. One, we have a pretty significant signal here for the tournament and the tournaments leading up to it. And one of those is that these teams are melting in the second half at an alarming rate. And so what should we do about that? Is this a situation where we should just be betting the first halves of these games? Because the record would have been a lot better. And we would have been sitting on, a Tennessee -4 first half ticket that won by 17 points. We would have been fine by that, right? So you do that. Or is this going to be a situation where live betting is going to be a really big thing? Right? Where, we should be on anytime any team, I'm not talking about the 1-16 type matchups, right? But anything that's sort of an, evenly matched type of a game. Are we going to be able to trust anybody to hold a lead? Because right now, listen, sometimes it's the right move to bet a favorite, right? Like I had Michigan State yesterday -6. But I'm watching that game and I go, I don't care if it's the right move. If you enjoy laying points in a college basketball game, if you enjoy taking the favorite of any sort of, any significant amount, you're an absolute sicko at this point, right? Because these teams it's melt after melt after melt. But the second thing is the reason that I play a lot of games here is because I don't think I can go 57% in college basketball. And that's what people sort of don't understand, the difference between a sport like the NFL, where I believe that I can go 56, 57%. I know that's sort of a thing that like, no, nobody can do that, blah, blah, blah. I feel like I can. We did this past year. Other years been a little bit lower, right? And years where I've, cashed in the Las Vegas Super Contest, those years were special years where you end up going 60%, but it's a small sample size. Because in the contest, you're betting, 85 games. Now it's 90 games with the 18-week season. And beyond that, you're betting a few more games beyond that. We do, the pod, we do about 8-9 games per week, right? But then in an 18-game season, you're betting like 100-ish, 120, 130, 140 type games. That's not a ton. That's a small sample size. That, like when you're playing roulette or craps or blackjack, you can get in when the table's hot and you can get out pretty quickly, right? If there was 500, 600, 700 NFL games, it'd be a lot more difficult to hit at a high percentage because there's just too many games, and you would be forced to sit at that blackjack table for 5-6 hours, right? And the longer you sit at the blackjack table, the longer you stand at the craps table, the more chances are the house odds are going to catch up to you. And that's what we're playing against. We're playing against house odds. But when it comes to college basketball, I don't think I can go 57%, but I think I can go 53, 54% because I have what I perceive to be about a point of an edge on any game that I bet. Right. So when we talk about a bet, that means it's something like, well, I think this number should be +6 and the number's +7. And does that guarantee us anything? No, it just means that I think I have a 2 to 3% of an edge. And if that's the case, I can go 53%. And so if I'm looking to make, say, 15 units, and I'll tell you right now, I was, going through my records on, I think it was Friday, all the days blended together. But I go, man, I made my 500th regular season bet on, it was like Thursday or Friday. I'm like, wow, we made it to 500 games bet on college basketball season. And it ended up 283, 243, and 6. And so you go, wow, okay, 283, 243, like 243 losses, first of all. Like that's a lot of free throws not going your way at the end of a game. But that's 53.8% on 526 games in college basketball, which for me is a really good season. But all that gets you, I shouldn't say all that, isn't like, it doesn't sound like much, but that's 15 units. That's up 15 units on the season, right? At just going 53. But you have, in order to get those 15 units, if that's, say that's the goal for next year, which I would be fine next year for up 15 units at the end of the season for college basketball. But if that's the goal next year, right? I have to go 53.8% on 500 bets. But to get those 15 units on 100 games, I have to go 60 and 40. Right? Because of the juice that we have to pay based on, obviously the system that we're dealing with here on a -110 bet. Now, if you can pay a little bit less juice on books that have, -106, -105, that's even better. But I have to go 60% in 100 games to do the same thing that I did by going 53.8% this year. If I was going to only bet 200 games, right? Because again, people are like, man, 26 games on a Saturday. This week it was 30 plus games on a Saturday. Like, man, that's crazy. But again, if my edge exists that I can go 53%, and I acknowledge, part of betting, right, is just admitting to yourself what your strengths and weaknesses are first and foremost, and then what a reasonable rate of winning is. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to go 56% on 200 games. Like maybe I am, but it's going to be lucky, right? I'm going to attribute that to luck and a good run. I might still attribute 53.8% over 500 plus bets to luck and some pretty good running, right? Like as much as I just listed 3 bad beats. I feel like, a lot of years there are times where I'm like, man, I hit more bad beats than I did good wins because everybody kind of thinks that. This year, I think I can admit that when it came down to the late game, I was on the right side of more sort of bad beats, if you will. But part of that is getting that extra half point, getting that extra point and having those games turn from losses to 2 wins. Because if we had 10 of those, and that's 10 over 500, you can imagine how different the record looks, right? If you have, -4.5 instead of -3.5, that's going to catch up to you over the course of 500 plus bets, right? So getting in at the right time, we always talk about getting the best of the number, right? And it's easy to say that in the NFL playoffs when it's, +6 or +6.5, -3, -3.5, right? That's where, it becomes a focus, right? It's magnified in the NFL, but in college basketball, it's the minutia, right? It is those small, the win versus the loss over the course of 500 games that turns 53.8 into 52, and maybe it's break even, that sort of thing, right? It is a volume type of deal here. And that's the difference between college basketball and the NFL. So when games are coming down to free throws, at overtime, at the bell, like these situations that were happening at seemingly every third game this past weekend, if you have a point edge on games, you can turn 50-50 into 53.8 and 46.2. Unfortunately, that's what we were able to do this season. So Sunday, much less eventful, just a solid 8-6 across the board on the day. And there wasn't any games where it was like, well, that was an atrocity of a bad beat. That one was a ridiculous win. It was like, nope, was way wrong on the Drexel Dragons and Hofstra and that sort of thing, and was way right on the Michigan States, on the Tulanes of the world. So regular season done, like I said, 283, 243, 40 games over 500, though a plus 15 unit season, which we're happy to do. That's definitely at least a goal for next year to improve upon, but I would be happy again with 15 units on a season, especially one that's, by and large, it's, 2 months, right? Because we don't do a ton of non-conference college basketball betting. So when you think about 500 games, a lot of that's in the last 2 months. So it's been a wild ride.
Yeah, what a ride it's been for sure. And lots of numbers talk, which we love. And this is why we enjoy having people come to the pod to learn the numbers, to discuss that angle of sports betting. But of course, there's another side of sports betting that we also enjoy. And, we acknowledge, because I'm the one that sometimes comes out here, and I'll be very honest about making bets with maybe my heart more so than my brain, which is a part of this ball game. But I will say there was something that I enjoyed that involved a very big college basketball game on the weekend. And that was watching Coach K and Duke just go down in flames. I'm going to be honest here. We were talking last week about the farewell tour, and, I was just like not excited for it because the love-in of Coach K. Yeah, whatever. Cool. I get it. Legendary coach. But part of college basketball to me is disliking Duke. And so that couldn't have been a more perfect scene. And the spread, we talked about it because, again, we talk about making bets with our heart, but we bring the numbers into it as well. But you sat here and said it was too many points for North Carolina. That's what we talked about last week. North Carolina not only covers the spread, they win outright.
Well, they covered minus 12, right? North Carolina covered minus 12, right? When it all came down. That's what we should have been on. That was
the spread, right?
We should have been on the alternate.
That's what the spread was.
Yeah,
right?
Should have been on the alternate line.
But in terms of just the scenes, right? Because, we make the jokes, but the actual serious nature of it was just talking about how Duke was getting overvalued, because the assumption was, oh, of course they're going to win this game. It's Coach K's last game at home and the crowd's going to be rocking and blah, 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 blah. All the narrative stuff that we talk about all the time, which is the opposite of me going again, like with my heart hating Duke, right? The line moves because all these people are with their heart for Duke and the storyline and the narrative instead of the reality.
Yeah.
So how did that all play out for you? And we'll start with the number side of it, just because it's what you talked about, right? For that point spread to change that drastically from the first time those teams played to this game on Saturday seemed kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, we talked about how that first line back in Durham, Chapel Hill was like -3 or something like that, right? And it's like, well, how do we go from -3 to -12, right? That's a pretty big jump. That's 9 points. That, again, if we're splitting the difference, that means 4.5 points of home court advantage for either of those teams, right? For both of those teams, essentially, right? Or you can split it differently, right? Where it's 5 on one side and 4 on the other, or whatever.
Yeah.
But again, like, there's no travel involved, right? It's a bus. It's like, what is it, 5-mile bus ride or something down the street. So like, okay, that doesn't really make sense. And then also this rivalry,
road, right?
Yeah. And it's it's a matchup. It's a rivalry. That historically, like, the road team does actually pretty well in, right? Like there are, if you see some of the, old clips, right? It's like, well, North Carolina won that game at Duke. Well, Duke won that game at North Carolina, right? Like late game buzzer beaters, all of that sort of thing, right? And so like there just shouldn't be that much for home court advantage. And of course it wasn't, right? It was based on this idea that like, okay, it was a blowout the first time. There's no way that this can't go like great for Duke, right? This is a storybook and all of that sort of thing. It's like, well, they don't need to win by 13 points on this 12 point opener. But we talked about it last week where there was a couple of games, right? I think it's like San Diego State and Fresno and Oregon, Washington. Washington was an interesting one where we were right? We knew that Oregon was overvalued there. It even got higher than 4. It went to 5, and then Washington blew them out. Yeah. But San Diego State, another bubble team, right? Like that number was inflated, but the market caught on to that. And they were like, well, you can't make this a 9-point spread. And that thing got bet down to 7.5. And of course, that ended up going to double overtime. San Diego State ended up winning by a point. And so, right, they get the win that they needed, but they didn't get the cover. Well, we talked about how this game had opened on a Thursday or even like Wednesday night at 12. The market saw that and was like, no, like this is how smart the market is getting, right? This wouldn't have happened 10 years ago where they were like, no, we got to drag this thing down. And it ended up closing at 11, I think it was, right? And so you're able to get pretty widely 11.5, but like we mentioned, none of that mattered because the thing with that atmosphere, right, is like when you don't have the usual atmosphere and you have 100 former players that every time they cut to them, they basically had no reaction to anything positive or negative on a very sort of too cool for school type of a thing. And now I don't know that side of the court with that's not necessarily the student section or whatever, but like they're right behind the bench. Right. And it's sort of like, oh, my God, like all of these Duke luminaries, like the Shane Battiers, the, Wojos, the, Trajan Langdons, right? Like the guys that we grew up watching. And I imagine some of these kids, I mean, listen, they're a lot younger, so they would have different names that they were sort of, looking up to, if you will. But like Grant Hill, Christian Laettner, like, these type of guys are just standing right behind you that entire game. Right. And so when things are going great, like that's fine. And you could see when Armando Bacot went out of that game early on with 2 fouls. It was the same thing that happened in that first game. And that first game was instructive to North Carolina, knowing that if Bacot goes out with 2 fouls, they have to just kind of go with it and just let him play. Now, they took him out for a little while and they brought in this kid, McCoy, and it was pretty clear, like, this was just not a game for that young man, right? Like he was lost defensively. He was nervous offensively. It was just like, this game isn't for you. And it's funny whether it's like, as we get through the tournament here, you can say what you want about some of these teams, but like, and it's part of the not having any chill, right? In the second half, like letting these leads waste away that we see every single night. It's all part of that, right? If you're not, there's a different stage in the Final Four. There's quite literally a stage, but like when the heat turns up, and apparently it was incredibly hot at Duke in that building. Coach K tried to smoke out the Tar Heels, I think. When the heat turns up, like there are certain guys who can and cannot play, and Bacot is certainly one of those guys who can play. A couple other guys on North Carolina, they had I think 4 guys who had 20 plus points. That was an incredibly impressive win. And I said, like, I was looking for North Carolina to get out of here when it came to the tournament, because I reject the idea that just because you're a brand, you should make the NCAA tournament. If you're going to play 10 quad 1 games and only get 1 win, I'm sorry, like that wouldn't cut it for, the Murray States of the world, right? No matter how good they look on the court or coming off the bus, that wasn't going to cut it. And so they ended up getting this win. And so now I have to sort of go, okay, like, there you go. That's all I'm looking for, right? I don't care. As a sports bettor, we're just looking for results on the court, right? Back up what you're supposed to be, whether that's based on a brand, based on your ranking, whatever, just back up what you're supposed to be. And so they backed it up and they put Bacot back out there in the first half. And there was that end of the first half where it could have got into blowout territory, right? Duke was up 9 points. You're sitting there, we're at plus 11.5, plus 12. And you're going like, oh man, we could be in some trouble here if they don't get him back on the court and turn this thing around. And they end up stealing the last few minutes of the second half and turn that game into a 2-point game at halftime. And that has to be a boon to North Carolina. Shout out Boone, North Carolina, App State. But it also has to be sort of a drag to Duke where they like, oh man, like we had the knockout blow ready to go there and we let them off the hook. And they come back out and, again, North Carolina works it. They get a couple of 3 balls. And then all of a sudden, like this game just ends up it's a 6-point game late, and Duke's looking up, and that's the panic that runs in. And is that indicative to what we might see in the Final Four? Because right now, I saw a projection, it's a Joe Lunardi type thing, and it's like Gonzaga and Duke as the 1 and 2 seed potentially in the same region. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's Duke. They're going to do Coach K right. They're going to put him. They requested Chicago. They requested the Midwest region because that's. And this is. Let me just backtrack here for a second here. So Duke, but it's instructive of the game and your dislike for Duke and all that sort of thing, right? It gets leaked that Duke has requested that instead of being in the East, if they happen to be a 1 seed or even, maybe they're a 2 seed, we still put them in the East because that's what we do. They request to go to the Midwest. And I just happen to think like, okay, why would they request to go into the Midwest? Well, there's going to be this battle in the number 1 seed department here for the number 1 seed in the West between Gonzaga and Arizona, who you're not going to believe, they just happen to be the top 2 teams, right? So, that's interesting. One of those teams is going to end up as a 1 seed elsewhere. Okay. Yeah. Well, if the other contenders for a 1 seed in college basketball are Kentucky, Kansas, right? These feel like South region and East region type teams, right? Like you've got obviously, a handful of teams that could certainly qualify. If you're Duke, you want to be in the Midwest because you want to avoid Arizona getting moved over to the East. Right?
Yeah.
Because the Kentuckys of the world, when and if Kentucky wins the SEC tournament, or maybe it's Auburn that wins the SEC tournament, right? Whomever wins the SEC tournament, especially if it's between those teams, is going to get the 1 seed and is going to get the South, the 1 seed in the South. Which means Arizona is going to move over. Let's use Arizona as an example here, assuming Gonzaga takes care of business tonight. Tomorrow night, they get the 1 seed in the West. Well, Arizona is going to move to the East because as much as there's a couple of decent teams in the East, there's no real 1 seed contender in the East. So I wouldn't want anything to do with the East either if that meant I had to deal with Gonzaga and Arizona. Now, they know that Duke's not going to be put out West because it's Coach K, and they would never do that to him. And they make up this reason, it's Coach K's hometown, as if Chicago, like people are just flocking to watch Coach K coach in the regional final. Like that is for any he's lived in Durham, North Carolina for 42 years. I don't know if that was mentioned at all on Saturday. 42 years.
Nope.
Like, what does Chicago have anything to do with this guy anymore? Right? Like, there's no, like, that has nothing to, like, they're going to stay at his parents' place. He's 75 years old, right? Like, it's not like there's any advantage to them playing in Chicago other than they're avoiding the South region that would have either Auburn or Kentucky. They're avoiding Arizona, who's an absolute truck at this point, and they're avoiding Gonzaga, right? It's all strategic, but it's all BS. And so whether it's something macro within the sort of construct of college basketball, or whether it's sitting there watching him with his, his whiteboard, if you will, and having a kid just sitting next to him with a rag who's in charge of cleaning the whiteboard, because whether it's Shire or Krzyzewski, they can't be bothered to clean their own whiteboard and get a little marker on their hands, right? They have to have some, drone in Sector 7G sit there and clean up the board. This is why we don't like Duke, right? Like, this isn't like a race thing or a cultural or a economic thing. I mean, all of that sort of has tentacles in it, but it's like the stupid kids like booting it off of the court at the halftime bell to like get to the dressing room, get to the locker room before the team does, right? All of this stuff, like Duke puts it on themselves. And so when we all sit back and we laugh when they lose the game, and again, Duke, Coach K comes on and he does the speech where he's, telling people to be quiet and like, no, and the crowd, the crowd is going to do the crowd thing where they're like, no, it's okay that you lost. He's like, no, it is not okay. Like, we are better than this. And it's just like, you're just like, oh my God. Like, it's just being in that bubble for 42 years, you'd completely lose grasp of how the rest of the world sees you. And so whether it was years ago, I mean, there's the famous Dylan Brooks one, right? Where he's telling Dylan Brooks in the handshake line after a tournament game, after Oregon trucks Duke. And he's telling, Dylan Brooks, like, you're too good of a player to take the 3-pointer at the bell, right? Like, just for fun, like, you don't need to do that, blah, 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 because he is revered in his bubble. And he's revered in a pretty large bubble. Like, I'm not saying that this is some tiny thing, because listen, ESPN devoted an entire week's worth of programming or
they messed
promotion.
it up, but they did.
and so that's the other part that was glorious about this. And Shell, I got to say this to you as somebody who's a television production professional. Shell, where were you on telling us to bet Kansas, Texas to go to overtime? You know that this stuff happens every single time, like best laid plans. Now, the plans were pretty stupid, let's be honest. Like, had you paid any attention to Saturdays in college basketball, you never, and the 6 o'clock game is always, that's the main window for that game, because, they want to push the NBA game. It's at 8 o'clock. It's all sorts, synergies and whatnot. But like, every time the 6 o'clock game is a big game, like, it always ends up getting like, okay, there's 3 minutes into the game, and because the last game went long, because it's college basketball and they have to take 5 hours to review stuff in the last minute, and the fouls and all of that stuff that people get infuriated by college basketball. But like, we should have seen that coming. We should have been like, okay, what's the 4 o'clock game? That game's going to overtime for sure. Let's get a 10-1 on that, Kansas and Texas in this case. And of course, because betting always has to get in the mix here, Kansas covers -6.5 in overtime.
Right.
Like, and I almost bet this is when it comes down to the numbers, right? Like, I like Texas in that game. Kansas had played 3 games that week. This is a team not used to playing 3 games in a week. This is a team that a lot of times going into a Saturday game has had 4 days off, because they play a lot of big Monday games, right, for ESPN. Yeah. And they had to play an extra game because of obvious reasons, and a cancellation and an extra game getting played last week, and 2 really tough games of TCU. And so inherently, I liked Kansas. I like Texas, because the market, or unfortunately I guess turns out probably fortunately, the market also agreed and had that number a little lower than I thought it should be, right? My projections were 7.5. So my projections told me I should actually be betting Kansas in that game, because the line was 6.5. But I'm like, no, like, inherently, and this is where discipline and handicapping and stuff beyond the numbers has to come in. Inherently, I was like, well, I'm not going to bet Texas at a lower number than I think it should be, even if I inherently like Texas because of the situation here. And again, for 44 minutes of that game, I would have been in really good shape with Texas plus 6.5, ignoring the fact that my number was 7.5. Of course, it ends up landing on 7. And if I had just blindly taken the number at -6.5 and taken Kansas and just said, forget about it, not paid any attention to what had happened early on in the week, I would have ended up with an incredibly fortunate win, which would have been nice, especially considering what happened earlier that day. But again, like, we got to be on top of this stuff as television media professionals, knowing that this is going to get screwed up here. But they had a 20-minute ceremony that was planned that we were supposed to see, and it was just, here's the tip-off. And it's like, how do you not know that that's coming? So all in all, just a banner night when it comes to Duke and North Carolina and the Coach K finale at Cameron, of course, because that matters to everybody outside of Durham, North Carolina.
Yeah. I mean, between Bill Self purposely just throwing away the end of that game to go to overtime to screw over Coach K's ceremony, I thought that was awesome. I'm being facetious, obviously, for people who can't see us, while we're doing the pod. But between people paying thousands of dollars to like sleep in tents to then have Coach K to tell them to shut up, is like
amazing.
What is happening here? The whole thing is just insane, but it's Duke. It's why we hate Duke. Although I will say I did enjoy like the roll call of seeing like all the classic Duke dudes. Like, I was like, Trajan Langdon, the Alaskan assassin.
Weirdly excited. I was weirdly excited about Trajan Langdon.
But another thing we're going to hope for, some Monday plays. Can we get some quick picks here?
Ooh, quick picks. Yes. Okay. So obviously we've turned the page here. I mean, we have a bunch of finals tonight. There's 10 games tonight in college basketball. I have plays for 6 of them. We have the semifinals in the CAA, the Colonial Athletic Association here. Towson open 6.5. This thing's coming down. I like Towson here to beat Delaware. Delaware beat Drexel. I thought Drexel had the better chance if they were to advance to beat Towson. So I'm actually laying it. Again, I just talked about you have to be a total sicko to lay points in college basketball. I think that's fair here. I have this number closer to think I had this closer to 8. And so I'm a little bit concerned that this is going down. You can get -5.5 here, but it is what it is. Hit the -5.5 elsewhere in the CAA. I'm actually not going to play the College of Charleston UNCW game. Some finals tonight. We've got the SoCon final. It's Furman and Chattanooga. Grab Furman +1.5 if you can. I have this game as a pure pick 'em, so anything with a plus in front of it, whether you want to go money line at +100, +105, or +1.5 when it comes to the point spread. Furman +1.5 is a play there. Georgia State, grab -2.5 while you can. Hopefully that's still available by the time this podcast runs. They're against a sort of a personal favorite of mine to back over the course of these years and betting conference tournaments and playing in the conference tournament pool. 8 seed Louisiana Lafayette, but I think they're playing their 4th game in 4 nights because they were in that 8-9 game early on. Georgia State obviously didn't have to play in that game. They are going to be the fresher team and the better team. Georgia State -2.5. Elsewhere, South Dakota State, I think they truck South Dakota, laying 8 points there. Total sicko move on my part. And you want sicko moves. Wow, we'll save this one for the last one. This is the 5th one. I'm going Oral Roberts +1.5. Shell, we were this close to having Longwood, who made the tournament yesterday. Morehead State was this close to winning on Saturday. And we might have Oral Roberts make the tournament as well. So things almost got really weird in the bracket. And then finally, the sicko move. Sheldon's just nodding right now. He's starting to get it. The sicko move of the night, betting against Gonzaga off of a loss. It's the situation, man. Like, they're going to be overvalued. There's going to be extra point. And we already know Gonzaga's overvalued. I have this number at 10 against San Francisco on a neutral court. We're talking 13s. There may even be some 14s popping up here as I'm sort of looking at the odds board. That's too many. Sure, I get it. Gonzaga's probably going to win this by 20, but at a 3-point line difference to my numbers is just something I have to grin and bear at this point. So 4 other games don't really have a lean there. Santa Clara is kind of interesting to me elsewhere in the West Coast Conference. It's getting started for real, if you will, because that tournament never really starts until the semifinals. And then as far as Tuesday is concerned, lines are starting to populate. We're getting some action coming up here. I don't have any plays for the games just yet. You can follow me on Twitter at Emerson Authentic for that. But the one thing I will mention here as a futures play, Virginia to win the ACC. So when it comes to power conference futures and these tournaments, right? Like, obviously you have the power teams in the conferences, right? Like the Villanovas in the Big East and obviously Duke in the ACC. Well, for one, it's pretty rare that Duke wins both the regular season and the ACC tournament. Now, that's a high likely probability this time around because, one, they've already won the regular season. They don't have to re-win the regular season. And 2, the ACC just frankly stinks this season. All right. And so there's going to be a lot of teams in the ACC that are on the bubble, battling to get into the tournament. Maybe some teams that, listen, aren't going to make the tournament unless they win this tournament. Meanwhile, Duke, are they beatable? We just watched them get, when it comes to the final score, beat up pretty good by North Carolina. We have seen them lose a couple of home games and also come very close to losing some home games this season, right? There was a Wake Forest game there where they won by 1 point. They lost to Virginia. Virginia is the team that I'm looking at them. They're in the bottom half of the bracket. Duke is at the top half of the bracket. So if they met Duke, it wouldn't be until the final. There's that bottom part of that bracket is pretty soft. And North Carolina is their matchup. If they, assuming they win their first game, is the matchup in I guess it would be the quarterfinal. North Carolina just beat Duke at Duke, right? Like, they are riding high. They clinched themselves, it would appear, a spot in the tournament. This has sort of letdown spot written all over it, whereas Virginia's out, man. They are out of this tournament. They need to find their way in, and the only way to do that, maybe if they make the final, like the worm starts to turn on the perception of Virginia, but they're probably going to need to win this tournament. And they're 18-1 right now with a pretty good route. Like, what team can't they beat? North Carolina, they can absolutely beat North Carolina. Virginia Tech, they can absolutely beat Virginia Tech, right? Like, any team other than Duke, they can absolutely beat. And by the way, they have beaten Duke and played them very closely in their second game. Like, these two teams are more evenly matched, but they haven't had the consistency so far this season. They obviously have the good coach in Tony Bennett. They're 18-1 to win the ACC and find themselves a way into the NCAA tournament. At 18-1, I think that's a really good price, especially considering we're talking a lot of coin flip type games, even some games where they might end up being the favorite, certainly in their first game, but maybe even beyond that. Virginia, to me, is the team that can put it all together for a little run here because of the desperation mode factor, right? It's one thing winning 4 games in 4 nights. If you're already comfortably on the good side of the bubble, you win a couple games, everybody starts telling you, man, you made the tournament, you should be good to go, you're going to be an at-large bid. When you're a team that's as good as Virginia can be, and no one's going to tell you, people are going to tell you you have to win this tournament, that's going to give you that energy over the course of 4 days. That's the team that I would look to. There's always one in these power conferences, right? Where last year was like Georgetown and Oregon State. I mean, people forget that Oregon State had no business being in the tournament, but Oregon State goes and wins the Pac-12, finds their way into the NCAA tournament. I think that's Virginia this year, and it's certainly a better brand, at least sort of more recently, than the Georgetowns or Oregon States of the world. So at 18-1, Virginia on a tournament that starts on Tuesday is a play for me in the futures market.
Not bad at all. We like trying to find those value picks there for sure. Virginia, I like it, writing that one down. But let's switch gears here, as we spent a while there on the NCAA, but there's also some other stuff going on as well as we switch to the NBA. And last time we spoke about the NBA, we gave out some picks. Happened to be a good night of picks, but the point really for me.
Come on.
And now. I mean, the thing for me with the NBA, to me, is that the NBA is tough, right? And for me, the way that I look at the NBA on a night-to-night basis is just, you got to appreciate the good nights for sure. But to me, when you look at it, it's like you're trying to ride the wave. The NBA is a weird sport in terms of you never know when the stars are really going to play, who's going to be in, who's going to be out of the lineup. But you know that teams ride in waves. You're going to be on winning streaks or losing streaks. It's very rare that a team's going to be win, loss, win, loss, win, loss, win, loss. You're either playing well or you're not. So going back to, the last time we spoke, we were riding the wave of the Celtics and Heat wave in the East and fading the Raptors without Fred VanVleet. That's basically, how I look at gambling in the NBA. You're riding the waves, finding a way to understand which way the team that you're betting on is going. Are they trending upward or downward? So we talked about the Heat and what we'd be able to take going forward with Miami, as, they're kind of an under the radar team that is first in the Eastern Conference, right? Like, we talk so much about Philly and the Nets and the Bucks and all these other teams, but Miami is the number 1 team in the East. They're currently on an 11-2 run, but we said this week or last week, they're still in the middle of it. The show me test was here. They won and covered against the Bulls last week. They lost basically at the buzzer to Miami. They won and covered versus the Nets in KD's return. I know we'll get to the Nets in a sec. And they won and covered against the Sixers, who gave James Harden a night off in Miami, which just furthers to my point. The Sixers are not serious about life, but we'll also get there in a sec. The Heat are legit to me, right? That's the point that I'm trying to make here. And for the record, last week when we were talking, they were plus 550 to win the East. This week, as we're talking, they're plus 475. I find that super interesting. And the one thing, the detractors, hey, guys are missing out of the lineup. Maybe they're catching guys at good spots. The Heat have been missing players too, but it's what you were calling an institutional bet, right? You're betting on the institution that is Heat culture and the Miami Heat being able to plug guys in. And when Kyle Lowry, who hasn't been in the lineup for a while, when he does play, they're even at a higher level. So once they get him back down the stretch here, I'm just saying Heat futures are something for people to look at for sure. And especially as they continue this week of tough play. Another team we were focused in on, unless you want us to talk about the Heat, I was going to move to the Nets here.
No, go ahead. We can talk about both, but I was going to go to the Nets here because they've gone downwards. friend. Yeah.
Yeah, the Nets are also a team that we've been following, and we were talking about the chances of them getting out of the play-in tournament. And you talked about how their schedule would be tough. And I said, the thing is, I thought they need two of KD and Kyrie to play. The real first time that happened was Sunday against the Celtics. And the Celtics, we just talked about it. The Celtics wave, they're on one right now. Jason Tatum put in mega work and out-dueled KD down the stretch. The Nets, that was a loss where you could see it on their faces at the end of that game. They were not happy. KD was very disappointed with that loss. Kyrie, super salty, of course, because he has his ties to Boston. But the clock is ticking, and it's something that you were talking about in terms of can they make it out of the play-in? And I'm forced to agree with you here. It's not going to happen. But the other part of this was it came out this morning that Ben Simmons won't start practicing with the rest of the team until after this current road trip, which if you're paying attention to what we've been telling you, he was not going to play in that Philly game. They were going to figure out a way to get him to not play, or not even show up to Philadelphia at all, which to me is super whack. But now it puts the pressure on them in terms of, well, if you look deeper, and I'll go here to you and toss it over to you here for a sec, but if you look deeper into this, should people be worried with what the number is for the Nets to win the Eastern Conference if we know now for sure chances are they will have to go through the play-in tournament?
Yeah, because it hasn't moved. I mean, it's plus 275. They're still the favorites in the Eastern Conference. And again, like whether or not you think it's some fait accompli that they're going to make it through the play-in tournament, it's still a non-zero chance that they lose in the play-in tournament. And by the way, like tonight's game, is it tonight or tomorrow night? What day is it? March 8th. Tomorrow. Calendar at this point, meaningless to me. Is it March? Yes, that's all I need to know. At Charlotte tomorrow night, the team that they are currently tied with. And Shell, like game. We were just talking last week about the idea of like, okay, well, they're going to have to play in this in the play-in tournament, if you will. And like, it might be in Toronto, which means the spread is not going to be -8, right? It's going to be something closer to a pick 'em, no matter who is in the lineup for the Nets. But now you start adding extra steps, right? If they end up in this was 9th seed, right? And it's like, okay, again, maybe it's an easy win at home against the Hawks, should that end up being the case. By the way, the Hawks are tied with them as well. So it might be the Hawks, and when all is said and done, that sort of leapfrog the Nets here if they don't get their act together. There's just way too much uncertainty betting the favorite here as they slowly fall down the line here. Now, they're not going to fall out of the playoffs. But what if it ends up being a road game at Atlanta in that first game, right? Like that's a losable game. We'll see tomorrow if this version of the Nets is the version they end up having to roll with. Tomorrow night's game is going to be very interesting to see what the likelihood is that the Hornets could win a home game in a play-in tournament type of a situation. And by the way, even if they're playing that game, let's say they play that first game in the play-in tournament, then they got to go to the winner, or I guess it's the loser of that, the top tier play-in tournament game. And then, maybe that's Toronto, maybe that's Atlanta, or whatever. It's like, okay, that's another road game that we have to play. And then, by the way, okay, great. We ended up as the 8th seed. Now we have to go and play in Miami and be the road team in that series, right? Game 1, game 2, game 7, et cetera, et cetera. And then every road team going, like it just piles up, right? The number makes absolutely no sense. It's basically, I'll just say it. It is a sucker bet. This is the casino just trying to reel you in to, pick your game of choice, right? This extra bet that is just never, listen, I'm not going to say it's never going to win, but it's never going to be a valuable bet. And you mentioned the Heat at plus 475. Like, what if things sort of burn a little bit here for the Nets? And now the Heat in that first round, they get either the Hornets or the Hawks. They're going to be massive favorites. Like the Heat might have a relatively easy first round matchup that you're only now worried about a second and third round matchup.
This is why the end of the NBA regular season is going to be so interesting, right? Because if you're the Nets at this point, you really want to at least finish in the 7th or 8th spot. And that way you only play that one game to get the 7 seed. Because here's the thing. Yeah. it looks like the Sixers, who were in second, they basically punted the first seed by sitting James Harden in Miami, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you thought you had a chance to catch the Miami Heat, which the Heat, I'm pretty sure, have a pretty easy schedule. They got a lot of home games to close out the season. So if you're the Sixers, you look at that, you say, we don't care. We'll just give away the first seed. Okay, cool. Now, if I'm the Nets, the only team I'm really, really like worried about is probably the Heat. Right? Just because they're a best coach team and they're like a playoff, like that's going to be a grind. Right? So you want to get and make sure that you stay in that 7-8 spot. So then you play the one game, you hope that you win that one road game and you finish in 7th. Because here's the thing about the 7 seed now. Seeds 2 to 6 are separated by 2.5 games. Right.
Yeah.
So you could be playing Philly. You could be playing the Bulls. You could be playing Like, do you know what I mean? Like you could be playing Boston, which is not something that you probably thought was on the table like a week ago. Yeah. 2 to 6. Okay. It's like, it's either like Milwaukee, it's Chicago, it's Philly, it's Boston. Like,
it could be any one of those.
And if I'm the Nets, I like my chances against any of those teams versus my chances against the Miami Heat in the first round. So that's where I find it very interesting. And I mean, it could be the Celtics. We talked about the Celtics run and we just saw that Tatum as a beast. They're on the move. They're at 5 right now. You mentioned it, plus 850 to win the East. So things are going to be pretty crazy. But as we look towards some more picks here, the first thing as I always say, as the waiver is we're making these picks at 9 a.m. in the morning. Obviously things can change with injury reports that end up coming out throughout the day. But as long as, the main particulars are in, these are the picks. And to further your point here, the Detroit Pistons, okay, they're slowly starting to play a little bit better. They have no chance of making the playoffs or the play-in, but Cade Cunningham started the season a little slow. He has gotten into a bit more of a rhythm. And if you watch him as of late, my guy is just cooking. They got a lot of nice young pieces and they're starting to put it together. And I look at this line, which I swear I looked at it yesterday and it was Atlanta -8.5. And now I looked at it this morning and it's Atlanta -7.5. So I've already lost a point here, but I still think it's too many points for the Hawks. So give me the points. I will take the Pistons at +7.5. We'll move on to Chicago at Philly. Philly is favored at home by 6.5 points. We talked about riding waves, and it can be a positive or a negative. The Bulls are struggling. They've lost 4 in a row, but also looking a little deeper at the Chicago Bulls this season, they're 39-25 overall, but they're 10-17 versus teams at or above 500. That tells you they just don't play well against really good teams. The Sixers, they beat up on teams that might not be that really good. This is like an interesting matchup here. But meanwhile, Harden is expected to be back after getting a night off in Miami, which again, maybe it's just me and I'm reading way too much into this, but like really, bro, a hamstring injury, you're going to sit out in Miami. You're James Harden. Like, come on, man. Like, what are we doing here for real? What are we actually doing? But anyways, back for this game. Cool. The Bulls can't guard point guards, which is a very tough thing to say when you're going up against 2 guards like Harden and Maxey, who's also been cooking. And Chicago has no answers for Joel Embiid. That doesn't spell, success to me. Right. So yeah, give me the Sixers -6.5 points. That is a lot of points, but I like it. Sixers at home. For our third pick of the night, we're going with Golden State at +9.5 in Denver. Denver won last night in OT versus the Pels, who, by the way, are balling as of late. But this is a makeup game from an earlier game in the season that was postponed. And you have to play the Warriors now on the second night of a back-to-back. I get the Warriors are struggling. Steph, after the loss to the Lakers, said he doesn't care about seeding. Clay looked horrible against the Lakers, breaking so many shots. Draymond still isn't back yet, which obviously is a huge piece for this team. And yeah, you could probably use Draymond to guard Jokic. Might be a thing you might want. So Jokic might go off. He definitely will go off tonight, for sure. I get it. But the 9.5 is just too juicy for me. I got to take those points with the Warriors, who again are not on the second night of a back-to-back and did not play in OT last night. Those are just some of the things that I like to look for, a potential bounce back. Like, a bad loss to the Lakers. You should beat the Lakers if you're the Warriors, but also now an opportunity to bounce back. I just can't see them getting blown out by Denver. So, hey, that's it. And the one last thing I'll leave people with speaking about the Lakers, the Lakers play against the Spurs tonight. Spurs are favored by 2.5 points. Okay. I don't know if you want to bet on the Lakers. I'll leave that to you. Cool. I was a believer that LeBron James was going to just shut it down at some point and just be like, our team sucks. We can't make the playoffs. I don't want the embarrassment of losing or maybe not making the play-in or maybe not winning in the play-in and all that fun stuff. I was a firm believer that was about to happen. And then I realized what's actually happening here. And my guy is turning it up for the stats. LeBron James is about narrative, right? And when you look at what's going on right now, my guy is firmly trying to put his team on his back scoring wise. He's at the very top of the league in terms of field goal attempts, which is not something we've really seen from LeBron James at any point of his career. But now we're seeing it now at age 37. That's incredible. But why is he doing that? I think, and I don't know if you follow, I know you're not a big Instagram guy. I know you're not a big social media guy, but if you do happen to follow LeBron James on social media, he is a fan of LeBron James. Meaning he's reposting every single account that posts LeBron James 56 points. He's reposting that. His whole Instagram story feed is just reposts of himself, of like the NBA's meme of his 56 points, of this fan's meme of his 56 points, all of these things. So now I take that information and I say, wait a second, how can we win off this? If I don't want to bet the Lakers spread, I'm just going to bet LeBron's over in points because he's getting busy. And tonight it's 30.5 against the Spurs. The Spurs really don't have an answer. Like, who's going to really guard LeBron on the Spurs? And that way it doesn't really matter who wins the game because LeBron is just going to get buckets so that he can post Instagram captions of washed king and all those fun things that he's made up, these narratives to put out there. He can be dapping up Matthew Stafford sitting courtside and telling Matt Stafford and his wife, well, of course I had to put on a show if you guys were in the building. Like, all of these things are just so LeBron and it's so NBA. And I get that's why people hate the NBA. I get that's why people love the NBA, but I'm here to tell you, we're always looking at ways to make money off the NBA. And I'm saying, take the overs in LeBron James points as long as he's still playing during this regular season, because he's trying to get busy. And
so 3 things to that, right? One, and this is sort of, I think, the graduated reasons why, right? Number 1, he doesn't have anybody to pass to, so he can be absolutely guiltless about getting those shots up. 2, you're going to get some decent market value. Now, I mean, listen, 30.5 points, that there may be an adjustment at that point, right? Like, because we're used to like LeBron being relatively low, like in the low to mid 20s, because it's like, well, it's, LeBron's thing isn't necessarily scoring. But 3, and I think the most important part, and the sort of, you need the sort of, what's the term, sound and the noise, or the sound and the whatever, 38,387. That's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's all-time scoring number. 36,720. That's where LeBron James is right now. And let's be honest, what matters to LeBron right now? Like, maybe it's another championship, but it's the resume. He wants to be considered the GOAT. He's taking this opportunity to put up 50, 40, 35 a night to get that number down quick so that he can get to that next season. Now, he's obviously talked about wanting to play with Bronny and all of that sort of thing. But honestly, I think that's more about just getting his kid into the NBA than it is to like have this season or sort of cap his career, because who knows if he's going to play another 3 seasons. So that's the motivation for all of this, right? Yeah, LeBron's always been... LeBron's always been LeBron, if you will, right? The motivation is to get up as many points as possible to get to the end here. And for LeBron right now, the end game is certainly passing Kareem and getting to 40,000 and then putting that number on, up on a banner somewhere and going, see if you guys can pass 40,000 points. Like, to me, that's what this is all about.
1,000,000%. LeBron James, there's always a reason behind everything he does. We know it. How can we take advantage of it? Let's bet LeBron points overs. I like it. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff we just talked about there. And unfortunately, there's not enough time for hockey yet again. But maybe next episode we'll get to hockey. I don't know.
So close.
I don't know.
So close.
I apologize, hockey, but I still love you, Austin Matthews. I still love you. But where can the people find more information from you, my friend, on the social medias?
Yeah, busy couple of weeks here, man. Like, I've got 4 conference tournament previews that I have to do as soon as we're done here. Everything that I do over at The Score gets retweeted through @MRussAuthentic on Twitter. Look for a bunch of fun stuff online. Twitter Spaces on Sunday. We're going to do a fun Selection Sunday pod here as well. That's going to be exciting. And then, of course, bracket, all that kind of good stuff next week. So yeah, man, a ton of college basketball content coming through @MRussAuthentic on Twitter.
Well, as always, thanks again for joining us here on the pod. We'll catch up soon, my dude.
Thanks, brother.
Thanks to Matt for coming on the pod. And if you want to follow me online, you can do so on Instagram @SheldonAlexander and on Twitter @ShellAlexander. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the DRF Sports Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also rate us, review us, like us, all that other fun stuff. But for more from this new project from DRF Sports, just a little reminder. If you're unfamiliar with the letters DRF, it stands for Daily Racing Forum, which has been around for over 100 years, giving you all of the horse racing information, data, and analysis. But now we've taken over the entire sports world. So if you want coverage on every football game, as well as the NBA, MLB, college sports, and more, head to drf.com/sports for all of the details and insights, as the site has all of the data on every game, including offensive and defensive stats, betting angles, line movements, key injuries, team stats, and more. The DRF data is what powers our power trends. So if you want to see which trends our analysts have selected, follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. If you want access to all of the raw data, drf.com/sports. That's where you can find the usual previews as we deep dive into the games. And of course, we got you covered on this podcast. However you want your betting information, we've got you covered. Again, my name is Sheldon Alexander. That's all I got for now. But until next time, see ya.
Thanks for listening to the DRF Sports Podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. For more sports betting advice, go to drf.com/sports and follow on Twitter @DRF_sports.